Hello fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today we are going to continue talking about the short stories of Ambrose Bierce, and specifically the short stories that inspired Robert W. Chambers to write The King in Yellow. I was originally just going to do The King in Yellow and go over them this week, but I had to go backwards just because learning that Ambrose Bierce created Carcosa and Hastur and I think one other, Helia? I can't remember. But yeah, Ambrose Bierce created three words, Carcosa, Hastur, and this other one that Robert W. Chambers was inspired by and used, and eventually he created his own King in Yellow in this universe. And linked them to Carcosa, and all of this eventually became part of Lovecraft's mythology. So the one I'm going to go over today is the short story that mentions Hastur. And this is a very different Hastur than we find in Lovecraft. This is not an ancient elder god of evil. In this case, Ambrose Bierce just introduces him as a god of shepherds. I think he was just trying to create a unique mythos for a fantasy world that this story is set in. And the story is called Haïta the Shepherd. So just some really quick publication history on this story. It was first published in The Wave, which was a San Francisco publication on January 24th, 1891. So about 5 or 6 years after the publication of An Inhabitant of Carcosa, which we talked about yesterday. To hear more about Ambrose Bierce, go to yesterday's video if you haven't watched it already. That's where I talk about An Inhabitant of Carcosa, and I also introduce Ambrose Bierce. But he was writing late 1800s and falls kind of between Poe and Robert W. Chambers in his writing career. Also, if you can hear rain, it is raining in our desert today, which is wonderful. We need all the moisture we can get out here. But if you can hear it on my skylights, I apologize. But it does kind of set the mood for a spooky fable for today's story. So, today's story, as I said, is called Haïta the Shepherd. That's how I pronounce it. I don't know if that's how most people pronounce it, but that's what I get out of it. Okay. I'm actually going to be reading a few quotes from this one because the prose in this one is so incredible that I feel like a summary of this story will never, ever do it justice. So I really want to read some of his wonderful prose while we talk about it. And, of course, there will be spoilers for this story. Again, this is under 10 minutes to read. I believe you can find people reading it on YouTube. It is in the public domain. And you can find it on the internet, really, anywhere. It was also included in his Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, his short story collection. Also in Can Such Things Be short story collection. This is the only story out of all the ones we're going to go over this week that I don't have a physical copy of. So I've had to order a copy of the book so that I have a physical copy of it. But I did read it on the internet. So I'll show you the actual book that has it in it when I find it. So I'm going to just read the opening paragraph of this because it's really stunningly done. Haïta the Shepherd by Ambrose Bierce. In the heart of Haïta, the illusions of youth had not been supported by those of age and experience. His thoughts were pure and pleasant, for his life was simple and his soul devoid of ambition. He rose with the sun and went forth to pray at the shrine of Hastur, the god of shepherds, who heard and was pleased. After performance of this pious rite, Haïta unbarred the gate of the fold and with a cheerful mind drove his flock afield, eating his morning meal of curds and oat cake as he went. occasionally pausing to add a few berries, cold with dew, or to drink of the waters that came away from the hills to join the stream in the middle of the valley and be borne along with it, he knew not whither. So we're introduced to Haïta, who's a shepherd that has a very innocent heart. When Haïta's watching his sheep, he likes to lean against a tree and play a pipe. And sometimes he spots what he calls minor Sylvian deities peeking out to watch him play. And when he tries to look at them directly, they disappear. And we start to get an understanding that Haïta has always lived this life and that he is very lonely. From this, he drew the solemn inference that happiness may come if not sought, but if looked for will never be seen. For next to the favor of Hastur, who never disclosed himself, Haïta most valued the friendly interest of his neighbors, the shy immortals of the wood and stream. So he really wants to be friends with these gods, and so Haïta's life continues like this, and we begin to realize how lonely it is, and the fact that he's always lived and taken care of this flock of sheep in these mountains and woods. So everything's always the same, except for when it rains or there's a huge storm, and Haïta at this time hides in his cave with his sheep and prays to Hastur that he does not destroy the world, but instead takes out his wrath on him. Also, during floods, Haïta prays to Hastur as well. Sometimes when there was a great rain and the stream came out of its banks, compelling him to urge his terrified flock to the uplands, he interceded for the people in the cities, which he had been told lay in the plain beyond the two blue hills forming the gateway of his valley. It is kind of thee, O Hastur, so he prayed, to give me mountains so near to my dwelling and my fold that I and my sheep can escape the angry torrents. But the rest of the world thou must thyself deliver in some way that I know not of, or I will no longer worship thee. And Hastur, knowing that Haïta was a youth who kept his word, spared the cities and turned the waters into the sea. I love this part of the story because, number one, we jump into Hastur's mind a little bit. And this has been playfully mythological the whole time, with the Sylvian deities watching him play his flute. And it reads very much like a fable, but also like a myth. And we see Bierce starting to create his own mythos, which is something that became very important to both Chambers and then finally to Lovecraft, and is really a staple of a lot of cosmic horror and weird fiction. This, Conan has gods too, Grom, right? And this creating, this myth making is very important, I think, in weird fiction. So Haïta's life has always been like this. The only connection he has is to this human he calls a holy hermit, a holy man that lives an hour away from Haïta. And that is the only human connection that he has. And that's why he knows that there's a city that lies beyond his valley, is because this holy man told him. So Haïta is growing up, of course, and he begins to notice his sheep dying, and he doesn't understand death really. He calls it the change, and he suddenly starts to become afraid that not only does he realize he's going to go through the change, but he's afraid of when he's going to go through the change. So basically, he is faced with his own morality, and it terrifies him, and it terrifies him to such an existential degree that he can no longer take care of his sheep. He just puzzles all day. He stops going to Hastur's shrine, and he stops taking his sheep to different parts of the valley. He just leads them to the same place, and sheep wander off, and he doesn't care, and all the sheep get very lean, and the one spot he takes them to overgrazed, and he is just in this terrible rut. One day he's had enough of this, and he decides that he can no longer sit and contemplate a concept that the gods will or information that the gods won't give him. He's got to let it go. He's got to just do right by his flock and worship Hastur, and whatever happens with death is in the domain of the gods, and he just can't care anymore. And the moment he thinks this, a bright light flashes, and he thinks that the sun has come from behind the clouds, and he looks up, and it's not that. There's not a cloud in the sky, and he looks back down, and there is a being in front of him. Suddenly, as he spoke, a great brightness fell about him, causing him to look upward, thinking the sun had burst through a rift in the clouds. But there were no clouds. No more than an arm's length away stood a beautiful maiden. So beautiful she was that the flowers about her feet folded their petals in despair and bent their heads in token of submission. So sweet her look that the hummingbirds thronged her eyes, thrusting their thirsty bills almost into them, and the wild bees were about her lips, and such was her brightness that the shadows of all objects lie divergent from her feet, turning as she moved. This is, in my opinion, my favorite bit of prose from Ambrose Bierce from these two stories. It's incredible. It is mythic and folkloric and smacks of fairy tales, and the way that he describes the beauty of this being with the flowers bowing their heads in submission, but really truly the hummingbirds flying around her eyes and the bees all around her lips. It's almost scary. It's really an incredible description, and begs to be illustrated, I think. I think it's incredible. So Haïta, of course, is blown away. Never seen a woman before, let alone one of this level of beauty, and he tries to worship her. And she puts her hand on his head and says, "Don't worship me, I'm not a god." And he stands up, and they both just stare lovingly into each other's eyes. And after a moment of this bliss, he finally asks who she is and where she comes from. At this, she laid a warning finger on her lip and began to withdraw. Her beauty underwent a visible alteration that made him shudder, he knew not why, for still she was beautiful. The landscape was darkened by a giant shadow sweeping across the valley with the speed of a vulture. In the obscurity, the maiden's figure grew dim and indistinct, and her voice seemed to come from a distance, as she said, in a tone of sorrowful reproach, "Presumptuous and ungrateful youth, must I then so soon leave thee? Would nothing do but thou must at once break the eternal compact?" I love this idea of the eternal compact. We never get an explanation of what that means, but it creates mystery, and we're going to talk about mystery a lot when we talk about Robert W. Chambers. At this, Haïta falls to his knees and begs her not to leave. He looks for her and cannot find her, but he hears her voice. And there's a weird part in this short story where I think Ambrose Bierce made a mistake. He says that as he's begging her not to go and looking for her, that he walks around and calls her name. And of course, one of the major pivots and hinges of this story is that he does not know her name, that he can't know her name. So I think that was a bit of a mistake. He looks for her and cannot find her, but he hears her voice. "Nay, thou shalt not have me by seeking. Go to thy duty, faithless shepherd, or we shall never meet again." So he does just that. He sees to the needs of his sheep. So he can hear the wolves howling, and so he spends his time that evening protecting his flock, gets them into the cave, and then goes to the shrine of Hastur and prays and gives thanks that he's able to protect his sheep. When Haïta awoke, the sun was high and shone in at the cave, illuminating it with a great glory, and there beside him sat the maiden. She smiled upon him with a smile that seemed the visible music of his pipe of reeds. He dared not speak, feared to offend her as before, for he knew not what he could venture to say. "Because," she said, "thou didst thy duty by the flock, and didst not forget to thank Hastur for staying the wolves of the night, I am come to thee again. Wilt thou have me for a companion?" "Who would not have thee forever?" replied Haïta. "Oh, never again leave me until I change and become silent and motionless." Haïta had no word for death. "I wish, indeed," he continued, "that thou wert of my own sex, that we might wrestle and run races, and so never tire of being together." At these words the maiden arose and passed out of the cave, and Haïta, springing from his couch of fragrant boughs to overtake and detain her, observed to his astonishment that the rain was falling, and the stream in the middle of the valley had come out of its banks. The sheep were bleating in terror, for the rising waters had invaded their fold. And there was danger for the unknown cities of the distant plain. So he has to see to this, of course, and he does not see her for many days. He takes the trek to see the holy man, and is just taking leave of the holy man, and he's decided the holy man has gotten old enough that he's going to come back the next day and pick him up and piggyback him and take him to the cave in order to take care of him. And he thinks this is probably why Hastur gave me this valley and nurtured me here, was to take care of the holy man when he became old. And right at that moment, as he spoke, the maiden, clad in glittering garments, met him in the path with a smile that took away his breath. "I am come again," she said, "to dwell with thee if thou wilt have me, for none else will. Thou mayest have learned wisdom and art, willing to take me as I am, nor care to know." Haïta threw himself at her feet. "Beautiful being," he cried, "if thou wilt but deign to accept all the devotion of my heart and soul, after Hastur be served, it is thine forever. But alas, thou art capricious and wayward. Before tomorrow's sun I may lose thee again. Promise, I beseech thee, that however in my ignorance I may offend, thou wilt forgive and remain always with me." Scarcely had he finished speaking when a troop of bears came out of the hills, racing toward him with crimson mouths and fiery eyes. The maiden again vanished, and he turned and fled for his life, nor did he stop until he was in the cot of the holy hermit, whence he had set out. Hastily barring the door against the bears, he cast himself upon the ground and wept. The holy hermit then asks him why he's crying over bears. That doesn't seem to make any sense, and Hastur tells him the story. When he had ended, the holy hermit was a moment silent, then said, "My son, I have attended to thy story, and I know the maiden. I have myself seen her, as have many. Know then that her name, which she would not even permit thee to inquire, is Happiness. Thou saidst the truth to her, that she is capricious, for she imposeth conditions that man cannot fulfill, and delinquency is punished by desertion. She cometh only when unsought, and will not be questioned. One manifestation of curiosity, one sign of doubt, one expression of misgiving, and she is away." As I said before, I absolutely love the mythic quality of this tale. It can be read as a fable, in one sense, in that it seems to have a moral, which is happiness only shows up when he is willing to do his position without question, do what he is meant to do without question, and also worship Hastur. And of course, this could easily be replaced with God, with the Christian God. So it seems to have a fable, but I don't think that's the only reading of it. I think there's a lot more depth in this. And that's when we get kind of the mythic tale. And of course, myth, the way that I've always thought about myth is man's early attempt to explain the natural world around him. So, of course, the example I can always give, and I might have already spoken about this on this channel, is the story of Narcissus, where he falls in love with his reflection in the pond and never leaves it, and is eventually turned into the Narcissus flower. And that is why Narcissus flowers bend towards the water instead of up to the sun. This was a way for people to explain why those flowers bent like that. They didn't know at the time scientifically that they were catching more sun from the reflection of the sun off the pond than they were just looking up at the sun because of the trees and whatnot. So they made up this story, and that's beautiful to me. I like that. That's one of the reasons I love myth so much, is because we get to see very artistic and creative ways for people to try to explain the unexplainable around them. Here we see a modern mythic tale where Bierce tries to explain happiness. And there's so much that we can get from his explanation of this happiness. For instance, we get this really existential concept that when you try to figure out the meaning of life, you'll be absolutely horrified and terrified, and happiness can't come near you. Right? So this fits in line with this existential quality, the concept that we're all horrified with the uselessness of our own existence. It also feels very Buddhist to me in an interesting way, especially because a lot of these old Buddhist tales, when you go back to the Jataka and these other Buddhist tales and fables, a lot of them have holy men secluded on mountains, and this one does as well. And often those holy men will give some form of wisdom to somebody younger. And that happens in here as well. But the concept of happiness can only be with you when you do not think, I feel like is very Buddhist, right? The idea of no thought, of meditating until your mind is empty, and only then can you experience the moment. And in that moment, Bierce adds that being thoughtless in that moment and just experiencing everything gives you happiness. And I find that really beautiful. I think that's really interesting. It is strange to me because, of course, Hastur has turned into, in the Cthulhu mythos, this kind of evil deity. Is it him that's or is it the King in Yellow that's like the half-brother to Cthulhu? Something like that. But anyway, Hastur in this case is just a stand-in for God, I think, because, like I said earlier, Ambrose Bierce was creating his own fantasy world here with this one, and he needed a stand-in, his own mythos, and so he created Hastur. So, yeah, Hastur was really changed from this interesting, almost Buddhist fable, myth, fairy tale. Wonderful story. I really loved it, and I hope that you enjoyed it too. If you liked this video, please click like, and if you like this kind of content, please subscribe, because we'll be making a lot more of it in the future. And thank you so much for watching.